So, Thomas,
Yes, sir.
I have some very exciting news. So, we've been live now to the world with our podcast in iTunes now for a week.
That's right.
It's been great to see the response, and I have some big news for you. I've been saving this
Uh-oh.
because I know you've been monitoring some of the data, but there's been a very exciting development recently.
You know I don't like surprises.
That's exactly why I prepared it for you. It's going to require a little bit of a drum roll, so. We now, Tom, have 1 billion subscribers on the podcast. Can you believe it in 1 week?
I think that's a slight exaggeration.
No, Tom. So we have been featured now in, who's that dude on YouTube? PewDiePie, right? So he's referenced us several times. The outgoing president referenced us. We are 2-Bit Geeks is now the word of the year. And the media empire has just been growing in leaps and bounds. And so I know you've been like heads down doing this editing process and have been able to, see the response, but it's been overwhelming. So I just have to get your take on this.
I see what you're doing here.
What is it that I'm doing, Thomas?
You're trying to invent your own reality for your own advantage, aren't you?
Oh, you've caught me. You've caught me in an obvious attempt to introduce our topic of fake news. So, Tom, this has been, to put it mildly, quite in the news recently.
That's right. It has.
As we sit here at the end of 2016, the idea of fake news and the analysis of what that is and the impact it has had on not just U.S. politics, but information and society in general going forward has been quite the hot topic. And you actually started this off by sending me a link from the Wall Street Journal called Red Feed, Blue Feed.
Oh, yeah, I did see that, didn't I?
Yeah, that was the spark for this whole topic about how, depending on one's political persuasions, you see different styles of newsfeed, et cetera. But before we get into that, just to underscore what a big deal this has been, the president has spoke about it, the Pope has spoken about it, Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, has spoken about it.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, in response to criticism about how Facebook presents news. Oxford's word of the year is post-truth.
Aha.
So this idea of fake news, biased news, truthiness, etc., has been pretty huge. So we've wanted to talk about this for several weeks. So there's 2 meta things I wanted to address first. One is that I've probably been thinking about this for like 2 months now.
Uh-oh.
So yes, and so not only do I have notes, Tom, but this, my whole take on it, right, has had time to just sort of sit and gestate and marinate in my mind. So a little bit like Alec Guinness in Bridge on the River Kwai, I'm slightly anxious that I am a bit too overly attached to the result of my explorations on the idea. So
let me see if I can blow up your bridge then.
Yes, spoilers. I'm going to rely on you to keep me flexible on that. The other thing I thought was interesting is that, this obviously has huge impact to politics, which is the meta point that on our podcast, on our little creative expressive project here, Tom, we've made the conscious decision that we don't want to talk about politics.
Yeah, as much as possible, right?
Right. And, in preparing this topic, which has obvious applications to politics, I was thinking about why. And the first reason I think is just that, there's plenty of other sources, not only podcasts, but news, etc., that talk about politics and talk very well about it.
There's way too many sources for that, yes.
Right. Of varying levels of quality. But if you are of the persuasion that you would like to consume some political talk or reading or whatever, there's no lack of those sources, right?
Yeah, you can't swing a cat without hitting someone who's pontificating in a political opinion these days.
Yeah. So maybe because of that, right, our defined focus for our podcast is that we don't want to talk about partisan politics. And that's not because individually we don't have political opinions. Like I certainly do. I'm assuming you do.
I do, yes.
Yeah.
We don't need to let other people know what they are.
Yeah, and so not just because what we're trying to define what we're all about in terms of the things we cover is not politics, but I'm reminded of my college improv group that I was not part of, but had friends in, and they had kind of a rule when they were doing improv that they would avoid explicit words and content in their improv under the idea that it's just too easy to go there. It's not that it's not entertaining, it's just creatively a bit lazy.
That's right. Yeah.
And so they would have kind of, funny little put the dunce cap hat on and sit in the corner if you slipped up. So it wasn't like an ethical condemnation of explicit content. It's just saying the creative challenge is greater if you sort of don't allow yourself to go to those easy places. The other thing is, to me, fake news is in this concept is interesting as a phenomenon, as a pure sort of concept and what it's doing in history, etc. And I think it's harder to tease out the base mechanism of what's going on if I start going down those roads of like, well, this is how it applies to a politician I like or don't like. So with that being said, there were two or three things I thought to get us rolling here. One was the Wall Street Journal site, Red Feed, Blue Feed, where essentially it's showing you what it labels as a liberal Facebook and a conservative Facebook feed side by side. And you're able to filter feeds by topic, and there's a half a dozen politically polarizing topics, U.S. politics. And on the left and the right, you see the very liberal news sources and the very conservative news sources. And what's interesting here is that they have several caveats. They're saying this isn't representing what a liberal person sees per se. What they're doing is selecting half a dozen news sources that they've identified as being very liberal or very conservative.
Right. What this is doing is giving the viewer the opportunity to see what the other echo chamber looks like that they not necessarily reside in.
Right. And so not only may you see fake news here, like items that are completely fabricated, but you might see a news item that has a bit of truth, which is then heavily misleading, or you might see a news item that's only slightly that has the bias of interpretation.
Or just regular opinion pieces that you wouldn't necessarily counter in your usual sources.
Right. My first reaction to looking at this, one was, I'm scanning the sources that they're taking to see if any of those pop up in my personal news feed. And there's definitely a few that do. And then I'm looking at the side, which is not my typical side, right? And getting a sense. And I think this is a pretty common reaction, Tom. I don't know if you had the same reaction, but just of this sort of visceral reaction of not shock, but just bewilderment of, can people actually take this seriously? And I think this is probably a common reaction regardless of what side you're coming from. What was your feel when you looked through these?
Well, my reaction was that I think I've been kind of vaguely aware of this phenomenon for quite some time. And I think I talked about this with you before offline.
Yeah.
But I'm not a heavy user of Facebook, but I really dislike all the politics that people share on Facebook. And I try to show hide post all the time on this kind of stuff. Right. And so my feed has basically become baby pictures and vacation photos, which is what I want from Facebook.
So you've custom so Facebook has served the limited scope of what you want out of Facebook.
It has, yeah. And so when I'm looking at the red feed and the blue feed, to a certain extent, I've winnowed my feed down to basically being neither of those, which is right. I've seen it as a huge improvement on my Facebook experience.
Okay.
Even though, I mean, we both live in Massachusetts, so obviously our friends and family, we're going to be getting more of a blue state feed,
right? Just
based on where we live in the United States,
right?
But my feed, based on my years of feedback to Facebook, it doesn't look a lot like the blue feed that was in the Wall Street Journal.
Right. So you've made a conscious decision that you don't want your social media to be your news source.
Yes, a very conscious choice, yes. Because that is a very bad decision to make if you're getting your news from Facebook. You've already lost the battle.
Well, so that's an interesting question, because the other piece that I found, so once I looked at this Wall Street Journal feed, I then poked around, and there's There's an in-depth analysis of fake news that got a lot of attention from BuzzFeed. I don't know if you had a chance to read that article.
I don't believe so.
Okay. So basically, this was analyzing news engagements on Facebook during the course of the election, and it compared engagements between the top 20 fake news stories versus the top 20 real news stories. And when they say fake news, they're talking about something more extreme than this red feed, blue feed bias we've just been looking at. We're talking about complete fabrications. And what they found was that in the last 3 months of the campaign leading up to the national election, the top 20 fake news stories had more engagements than the top 20 real news stories. And by engagements, by the way, we mean shares, comments, clicks. So not just that it showed up in the feed, but a user did something with it in the social media sphere. The reason why this is so compelling is that, so unlike you, Tom, many people get their news from Facebook, and not just as an adjunct to other news sources, but depending on what story and how the data is formed, upwards of 50% of people use Facebook as their primary news source.
That's crazy. That is crazy.
And so I would conject, and I would put myself in this category, a much larger percent of people see impactful news stories in their news feed. So even if you are making a conscious decision that I want my primary news to be something else, you're still going to see news items appear, not just in your feed, but there's a little section in the top right that says trending news stories, right? So if you're on Facebook for your own recreational baby picture vacation photo kind of deal, these things are going to be there, right? And so there's an influence. So that's interesting. There's a couple other striking items in the BuzzFeed article was that, so when they looked at these fake news sources, some of them had only come into existence in the previous months leading up to the election, like in March and September.
Yep.
So you had a fly-by-night website, one of them that came up in September, right? So 2 months before the election, getting more engagements than a source like the New York Times, right? Or the New York Post or some other major real news source that you could think of, which is it's just astounding. And so I think what this has, at least the BuzzFeed and other analyses have done is raised this level from, you know what, there's crazy people that will believe anything, to this was a real phenomenon and it had a real impact. And this intertwining of news and social media has become a real thing. So the third sort of example of this that I'm sure you've probably seen is the CGP Grey video. This video will make you angry.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I remember that.
I think that's a really good complement to this blue feed, red feed, because he's essentially talking about how thoughts propagate through social media, and he uses the metaphor of germs. Right, about how you can think of a thought as a germ that exploits certain emotional weak points in you, and so he has this little chart where he shows what emotions are the most effective at getting a reaction from somebody, and so anger is one of the top ones, right? And so you post something that makes somebody really angry, and political things are sure to make someone angry, and then there's this other possibility that social media makes very easy to do, which is these germs or these thoughts can mutate. And so sort of by natural selection, you can mutate these to more and more effective stimulators of the emotion, which then propagate further, which et cetera, et cetera.
And Facebook is the ideal environment for these things to spread rapidly. It's basically just a mosquito-filled swamp.
Tell me how you really feel about social media, Tom. A mosquito-filled swamp.
By the way, folks, please like our Facebook page.
I don't know what to say to that, Tom. I've been spending all this time on the Facebook page. Now you're calling me a swamp. So let's tease this out a little bit. So you talked about vacation photos and baby photos. And then we're also talking about news. So both of these things, the recreational and the informational streams, right, exist on the social media platform.
Yes.
And I think I would have to really go back into the history of this because I haven't been on Facebook for 10 plus years. But the initial push and thrust of social media was not as a primary news information source. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. Yeah.
It's for the kind of recreational hanging out on the internet, catching up with your friends. So so to be somewhat fair to social media, I mean, there's people on Facebook who I would have zero contact with if it wasn't for Facebook.
That's right.
That's valuable. I definitely experience a positive benefit in my life from that. And yet this emergence of the information stream that is happening, that's being mixed in, because it's the primary stream of content that you see on Facebook is called it's funny, it's called the news feed, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's a emergence of both the recreational and the informational. And then where does that line get drawn is the open question. The other thing that CGP Grey references in his video Will Make You Angry is that not only will these thought germs mutate in order to become more effective, but the most effective is when you can have an oppositional force to that same thought. So and so what ends up happening is that an echo chamber will create what he calls a totem of the other, which is essentially the most effective caricature of the other perspective that's going to make you the most angry, right? And and whether one is red or blue, I'm sure you and I and the listener can sit here and imagine what's the most extreme hyperbolic caricature of the other partisan that will make you angry right now.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point for people to remember, is that when they do see these things from the opposite side of the political spectrum, 9 times out of 10, these are absolute caricatures of their viewpoints. It has some semblance in reality, but it's extremely exaggerated for the specific purpose of getting you angry.
So I like the phrase that you just used there. This is something that people have to keep in mind. Another way to phrase that is something to be aware of as a conscious consumer of information. Mm-hmm. Like at the end of that video, CGP says, it's your brain, be hygienic with it. So to me, there's this emerging theme of you turn on Facebook and the content, it just comes in, right? And it's just flowing over you. You certainly wouldn't walk into a buffet and just allow food to be just without your control, just flooded into your mouth, right?
Right.
If you don't make a conscious decision about how to curate that stream, then that information is just going to come in. And then if you're not trying to separate what is recreational versus what is informational, then it's going to have a potentially negative effect. So Tom, why do you think that this is a problem at this point in time? So it's 2016, right?
Yep.
Actually, when this is released, it's probably 2056, but it's 2016 at the time of recording. I have my own theory about why this is all happening now, but I don't want to. Again, I'm conscious of not wanting to hit the listener or you over the head with my preformed opinion. So what's your take on why this is happening at this point in history?
Because it makes money for these big media platforms to get people polarized. I don't think it's even more complicated than that.
Okay, but haven't news sources always been media and profit driven?
Yes. This certainly the technology underlying these current media platforms like Facebook enables the kind of viral nature of these things. Whereas a 19th century broadsheet doesn't get a lot of shares.
Right.
Whereas Facebook, you could post something 10 minutes from now and get over millions and millions of views within a fraction of the time it would take anything else to spread.
Right. So the distribution mechanism, I would say it's much more democratized.
Right. And traditional journalism has not kept up with this. I mean, that's been a complete failure on their part, is they have not embraced the new technologies available to them. Whereas these other big media companies who don't have the journalistic ethics that traditional newspapers do have, and they're eating their lunch.
Right. Okay. So there's two things I want to get to there. One is you just made a distinction between quote unquote big media companies and quote unquote traditional journalism.
Right.
And then the other thing is the ease of information distribution. Like when I think about why this is happening now, I tend to think of it in the context of the evolution of technology, right? And where we're now at the, what do you call it, Tom? Okay, here comes a word recollection tangent. I want to say okay, like if there's some process that's unfolding in history, and now you are at the leading edge.
The leading edge. There you go.
Oh, leading edge. Leading edge was one of the first computers I had in the 80s.
Be careful, you might tangent.
Oh, there's major
Tangent warning.
Major tangent.
Back away from the leading edge.
Can I just reference Death Trap Dungeon and Zork and be done with it?
Zork, that's something we got to talk about sometime.
Absolutely.
Write that down.
Let's just say I transcribed Death Trap Dungeon into a massive amount of if statements in BASIC while using my leading edge.
All right.
Okay, back to technology. Where was I? Oh, the leading edge. So, yeah. So I feel like we are at the leading edge, the final step of what has been a pretty rapid progression of technology over the last 30 years, right? So if you think back to like the 70s and 80s, the primary news sources were newspapers, magazines to a certain extent, and television, right?
And the three big networks on television, that was basically it.
Right. So if you want to be on equal footing with their ability to distribute information to the population,
you would need a huge distribution platform.
Exactly. And if you actually peeled it back, say, 50 years earlier and looked at the beginning of the 20th century, you only had newspapers. And so you would, the bar for a distribution mechanism is even higher, right?
Right.
So what's been happening is that gradually, I'd say from the beginning of the 20th century up until the advent of cable news, there's been this sort of slow, linear decrease in the difficulty of distributing news to the world or the population and what it would take. Prior to the advent of cable news, you would have to have a television or a newspaper distribution network in order to get information of your choosing out to the population. And with the advent of cable news, it made it not nearly as easy as it is today, but it started, I think that was kind of a watershed moment of, it still takes a huge amount of investment, but the bar has been significantly lowered, right? And so you had the advent of CNN and the internet comes along, and now the bar is even lower. And so all you really need in order to make something available, not yet findable and shareable, but just available, is a web page. So that sort of potential sort of existed. And so the distribution mechanism is getting lower, it's getting lower. And then I think what happened in the last, say, 10 years or so, and this is just my theory, is that it's been a combination of search ease and social sharing ease that we've been talking about, and also what I would call device ubiquity. We think of smartphones as just so commonplace now, right? To the point where people just say phones, you just assume everybody has a phone. It's been less than 10 years since the first iPhone came out. We forget about how it used to be you had to sit down and log on your computer and not have instant anytime access to this information stream, right?
Right.
It's very, very recent. And the search ability as well. So, I mean, search engines have been around since the dawn of the internet. But, Google, now the dominant search engine, has so refined its capacity for search that, not to get too much into the particulars of what drives the search algorithm, but it's pretty much based on what links to a particular piece of content.
Right. Links provide credibility.
Exactly. And so you want to pop up the search lists, and you need links and connectivity. And so the ability for Google to find things on the internet through all that noise and to pull up the signal has become more and more and more refined. And then social media, I think, was the final accelerator to this. So on the one hand, it seems absurd that somebody could start a website in September and have more informational impact than the New York Times on social media.
But it's possible, and it's happening.
Right. And so this all comes under the umbrella of what I think of as the democratization of media, where it used to be the sole sphere and purview of a few newspapers, and then expanding that and expanding that and expanding that until the point where any person with very little resources can affect the information flow.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, we're harping on the downside of that, but there's a huge upside to that as well. Just look at what we're doing. I mean, this would not have been possible in the earlier media landscape because, I mean, all that we need to get ourselves started up is just a computer and a microphone. We have the potential of reaching millions of people, although that's not going to happen. The potential is there. There's no barrier between us reaching that audience other than just obscurity.
Yes, and so it's a double-edged sword, or how you look at it. And so, I mean, even just that phrase, if you think of it in the most positive terms, the democratization of information, that it sounds like a very positive, healthy thing. And I mean, I just gave a very negative example of where a news source that was explicitly fake had an impact on a very major political event. And yet, one can imagine a situation where the public has been kept in the dark, and then one individual uses the power of the democratization of information in order to shine the light of truth to a positive effect.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main reason, like many oppressive governments are cracking down on social media in their countries.
Right. I think I would agree with Shakespeare on this, Tom, that nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Right? That there's a force or a thing such as the democratization of information is not moral or immoral, ethical or unethical per se, but it's how it is used and applied in the hands of human beings. Would you concur with that?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, and so, okay, so wonderful.
So what do we do about it?
Well, yeah. So then, well, so why is this a problem then? So and is it a problem? And so to me, this kind of gets back to what you were talking about before, which is being people need to keep in mind, I think is the phrase you used.
Yeah.
CGP talking about it's your brain to be hygienic with it. What I feel like what this has done is that it's exposed a fundamental flaw or problem with the human mind and with consciousness. And that now that it's out in the open and it's manifested, we have to deal with it. I guess one way to get at like a visceral example of this would be, imagine if you took a situation like the Middle Ages, where there was no public education, where conditions were very difficult, like say Middle Ages in like Europe, and you just dropped democracy, pure 100%, voter democracy right in the middle of that. Like, what do we think would happen? Like, do we think that the effective governments would be elected and policy would be reasonable? And
probably not. That was certainly the opinion of the leaders at the time as well. I mean, democracy was not something we invented in 1776. I mean, it existed thousands of years ago.
Exactly. And I think this core problem of, on the one hand, there's this sort of innate sense of fairness and justness of the government should be by the people, of the people, for the people, etc., and should be the will of the people. And yet there is the fear of actually giving this power to people. I mean, this has been a core problem of philosophy of politics for forever, right? Plato very famously struggles with this question in The Republic. Hamilton and the founders of the U.S. struggled with this question of wanting to empower the population with the direct vote, and yet understanding the danger of what you could call anything mob rule or.
Yeah, that's why we have the Electoral College.
And that is.
But that's another topic.
Yes, that is. Oh, well, let's not tangent there. But you bring up a good point, and so why is that? So why is it so dangerous to just drop democracy into the throes of the mob? Like, why would just pure vote in the middle of the Middle Ages have been a bad idea?
Because of the threat of demagogues, I guess.
Okay, so why are you and I personally not feel like we are not prone to be taken advantage by a demagogue?
Are we not?
Okay, maybe we are. Maybe I'm giving ourselves too much credit.
That's always the trap you might fall into is giving yourself too much credit, especially when you're talking about political topics. I think you need a lot of humility and not think that, my way is the right way, because that way lies the trap that all these red feed, blue feeds get themselves into.
That my way is the right way. Okay, so what you're just suggesting is the more enlightened perspective is to embrace this notion that I see a certain aspect of the truth, but it is not the whole truth.
Yes, I like that.
Okay. I'm not sure which notion is the primary notion. I'm not sure which bug in the program is most primary, or is patient zero here. The core reaction I have to like what is going on with people being susceptible to this force of fake news and biased news is this idea that our minds are not truth detection machines per se. That's not how they're wired. It's hard for me to talk about these things, these types of things, without just thinking about the core scene in The Matrix with Morpheus and Neo, right? Where he offers him the red pill and the blue pill, where you take the blue pill, you wake up and you believe whatever it is you want to believe. You take the red pill and he shows you just how far down the rabbit hole goes. And to me, the core essence of that scene is that it's a decision. It's a free, conscious decision. And if you want to believe whatever it is you want to believe, there's nothing in the world that is going to get you to out of that blue pill. You can pop blue pills for as long as you like.
Yeah. So I think the message here is that if you think that society's become too polarized and you want to fix it, you got to start with yourself.
Yeah, I would say. Wow, dude, you're leaping all the way to solutions, so I'm all with you there.
You can overcome these bugs as long as you're conscious that they exist.
Yes, but to even want to embark on the process of debugging requires the presumption that my program has bugs. Like what you were just talking about before, that any perspective can see part of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. Mm-hmm. Like that classic notion of three blind men coming up to an elephant, and one touches the tail, the other touches the trunk, the other touches the broad middle, and they each perceive vastly different things. Each of them true, but not one.
Not the whole picture.
Right. To even embark on this process, right, of broadening my perspective, of opening up the epistemically closed doors and trying to expose myself to some other perspective, which is also flawed and yet holds part of the truth, and to synthesize that, and it requires acknowledging that I am flawed, that my mind is flawed, and that I want to know the truth, right? And I think if instead of that, you want to know, you just want reassertion and reaffirmation of your own blue pilliness, it's very easy to do that. And I think what's happened, to circle back to, okay, well, what's going on now is that what the democratization of information has done is to make it's legalized free blue pills for all. Yeah. In my sense, is that I don't think there's anything fundamentally different about the susceptibility of human beings today than there was in the 1970s or before.
Right, there isn't.
It's just the technology has evolved to the point where this flaw, this cognitive tendency in human beings is now being leveraged by these, and it's a two-way process. I don't want to vilify Facebook or CNN or Fox News or whatever as the evil purveyor against our wills. It's like I really feel like in order to take a blue pill, it requires somebody selling the blue pill, but you also have to freely want it. I struggle with vilifying the news sources too much.
Well, I don't know. They are purposely taking advantage of our weaknesses in order to profit.
Yeah, I guess when you put it that way, it doesn't sound too good, does it?
So maybe there's some noble motivation behind that, but I tend to doubt that.
Well, okay. Well, so that's an interesting question. So do you feel like a casino is an immoral institution or unethical? Do you think that their business model is unethical?
Yeah, I do. I'm not a big fan of casinos. I mean, that's another industry that preys on people's weaknesses, especially the weakest among them are their prime customers.
Right. So I am devil advocating this a little bit because I also share the same base feeling with you that companies that prey upon human weakness for profit aren't that cool. And okay, so in the context of gambling, or in the context of fake or heavily biased news that makes us angry, when I think of what are they preying upon? They're preying upon what? Our emotions and our lack of control with ourselves. Would that be?
Yeah.
You think that's accurate?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And so I think it's possible as an individual to become aware of these bugs in the program, of these problematic tendencies, and then to work to overcome them. But it requires effort.
It does. It does require a lot of effort.
And I don't think it happens overnight. And I think that there are a lot of contexts in which this manifests. And so to expect any one individual to be born into a society which is operating under many of these influences, because, Tom, I guess in general, you can think of any culture or society as just an external manifestation of the tendencies of its collected individuals. As babies are born into the world, they're influenced by the tendencies of their parents and the caregivers around them and the society around them, and they sort of grow up, and their potentiality of their mind and their consciousness is influenced by these things, and they sort of grow up. And then, Tom, a slight tangent. I remember when I was like 11 years old or so.
Okay.
It's a very nondescript experience. I was walking back to my car in a parking lot in a mall.
You were an early driver at 11?
I was with my parents.
Okay, gotcha.
And I'm walking back.
I thought you were creating your own fake news story here.
That's true. Our listeners don't really know how fabricated this is. And yet, does it really matter? Oh, dude, this is like ultra tangent, because then you could start thinking about literary theories of criticism and deconstructionism. And when you get meaning from a story, if there's no intentionality on the part of the author, is that okay? And does it really matter? And then what is the meaning of the text in itself? And
Okay, settle down. You're heading to the car.
Yes, thank you. Oh, Tom, you're putting this like a meta leash on me. I love it.
You need it sometimes.
So helpful. All right, so I'm walking back to the car. I have this memory, and again, I'll say with self-reflection here that my own feeling about memory is that it's dynamically reconstructed every time.
Yep.
So, with that caveat, this is what my memory is. I'm walking back to the car in the parking lot of this mall. I open the door of the back seat, and I coughed into my hand and sort of like looked down at my hand, and I had this overwhelming, visceral experience sense of looking at myself, looking at my hand. It was like, and like this just gargantuan tidal wave of self-consciousness just snapped into place. And it was like dizzying. It was like physically dizzying. And I remember in the days and the weeks and etc. time that followed of having this experience of being very dissociated from my physical experience. Mm-hmm. To the point of like, I remember being driven home and just sitting in the car in the driveway and my mom saying, "You okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm all right." And just feeling just such it's like that feeling you get when you're very nervous or scared, but without the association of fear, like just this like weirdness, right? And it took me a long time before I actually felt like I could have experience where I was directly sensorily connected to it. Like we used to go to Fish concerts, right? And you remember I was a big dancer. I used to like to go get my own little dance zone, right? And just
Yep.
I remember that dancing to that kind of music, right, was one of the first times where I sort of reconnected with the external physical world, right? And so anyway, why was I telling you this story, Tom? What was there was a reason. There was a really good reason.
It's been lost to the mists of time, I think, at this point.
Roll tape. Let's see. We were talking about babies and kids, and you're conditioned into this environment. So for me, that experience of just overwhelming self-consciousness, that was my experience of becoming self-aware. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then from that point onwards, having a self-conscious experience where instead of just having an automated stream of inputs and impressions and conditionings and reactions and etc., that I could now sort of pause the movie, or at least step back, see it as a movie, and then reflect and think about it. And in so doing, that is the base empowerment for then changing how I am going to act in response to my environment. Because up to the point where you can insert yourself in that input conditioned response cycle, you're just going along for the ride, right? If you don't think about your actions, then you're just reacting. If I'm looking at my Facebook feed and something comes up that makes me really angry, and I'm like, rah, 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 and I share it and I comment angrily on it, and I'm just reacting and reacting and reacting. Whereas if I pause the inputs and I say, do I actually want to do this? Well, then I'm inserting myself into this process.
Self-awareness is an extremely important characteristic to develop.
Yeah, and we sort of, I think, as human beings and as a culture and society, don't have a really good framework slash mechanism slash understanding of how that all works and how we ought to utilize that in the conscious construction of our mental conditionings, of like CGP was saying, like about being hygienic with your mind. We don't have a good protocol in place for mental hygiene. And so what's happened now with this democratization of information is that technology, you think of this as kind of like a two-horse race, right? Between technology and consciousness, or rather technology and human beings' capacity to utilize this tool of the mind. I feel like technology has just leaped ahead 4 or 5 spots. And whoop, here we are. All of a sudden, we have the power, but we have yet, with great power comes great responsibility, right? It's kind of a Spider-Man situation where we have yet to develop the capacity to work this mind. And so without being able to have conscious control over it, it's being worked on for us. And we're going to experience the consequences. And now it's a race.
So how do you exercise mental hygiene in this environment that you've just described?
Yeah, it's hard. I feel like it's about finding different strategies and tactics to be aware of these bugs and to start to gain more conscious self-control over my mind's tendencies and habits. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's any one magic bullet. Like, so in my personal experience, I think this is a big reason why meditation for me has been such a core thing, is that I feel like if I don't consciously decide what I want to be the central influencer of my attention, then my attention is going to naturally pick one up. Nature abhors a vacuum, and your mind is going to be influenced whether you like it or not. And so what do you want those influences to be? Like when I'm going to bed sometimes at night, there's some TV shows on that have like very like violent content. And on the one hand, it's not like an ethical, moral thing that I don't want to watch these shows, right? And I think some of them can be extremely well acted and produced and, objectively, aesthetically good. And yet I don't want my mind and consciousness slash feeling to incorporate that input right before I go to sleep, right? And so I'm making a decision to curate that input stream. So I can sort of, in any one moment, do that. And yet, when I start to peel back the onion about, well, why is it that I do other certain things? And why am I engaged in this activity? Why do I like this? And why do I react emotionally to this person? It also, if I try and do a root cause analysis on myself, it sort of all comes back to this, well, did I really decide that core motivation? Or am I just playing out the string, right? Like it's sort of this dawn of realization of, I don't think that in many respects, I have been the programmer of myself.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I mean, dude, that's what, I mean, again, to reference the Matrix, but like, I mean, that's what it feels like to me, is that I've sort of become aware of living within a web of cognitive tendencies and habits, not only not of my own design, but I don't even fully understand how the mechanism of cognition operates. Do you remember the TV show Greatest American Hero?
Yes, I never watched it though.
Do you know the basic concept?
I know the concept, yeah.
Yeah, so there's this goofy guy who
gets the suit.
Yeah, a good-natured but goofy guy, and these super tech aliens come down and they give him this ultra powerful superhero suit. And they give him a manual, right, to explain how everything works. And the setup of the pilot is that at the end of the episode, he loses the manual.
That's our life.
Right. And so and so the rest of the series is wacky hijinks of him flying around and crashing into things and discovering various powers and of this suit. And that's kind of what I feel like is our situation as human beings with this mind, is that we have this ridiculous capacity for cognition and understanding, and yet we are in the throes of it being influenced and trying to figure out how it's working, while at the same time being affected by the inevitable progress of technology. And before we have really, written the manual, before the Unix man page has become accessible, Tom, the cat has left the barn. The horse has come home to roost, and technology is now out there, and we have to race to become responsible to be able to deal with it.
We got the greatest biological supercomputer ever created, but no documentation.
Right. Isn't that wild? Like, is that a design flaw in itself of the universe? Like,
it's not a bug, it's a feature.
Maybe so. Wow.
I think we were getting a little far afield from our original topic.
Oh yes, fake news. Well, you sort of jumped the gun about how do we solve it.
Yeah. Okay.
So how do we solve this Pandorica that has opened, Tom? I think your core concept of we need to keep in mind,
yeah,
is the clarion call, but it's not as easy as that. It's one of those problems that it's not just realizing it's a problem. You actually have to go and
you have to take an active role in how you consume news and information. You can't just sit there and let the conveyor belt of slop come into your mind.
Conveyor belt of slop.
Is it too late? Is it too late to change our podcast name
to the conveyor belt of slop? That would be awesome. Do you think it's possible to help other people with this problem? Like, we just talked about some examples of being hygienic with one's own mind, but I think I'm just trying to proxy for the listener here that I think most people probably feel that maybe this is yet another cognitive bias. Most people probably feel that other people are more susceptible to these things. I think when people get upset about the effect that this has had on world events, what they're upset about isn't that they were taken for a ride, it's that many other people were taken for a ride, right? So is it possible to help? How do we help other human beings gain control over their own consciousness? Because it doesn't do much good if there's only a minority of people that have this capacity, this resiliency.
Well, the only advice I can give is just to try to be more discerning about the news you consume. Like I said, I've curated my Facebook feed to try to cut out as much as possible anything that even has the sniff of politics in it, because I just think that's just corrosive. I've also made the conscious decision in my life. I do not get any news whatsoever from television.
Really?
I've completely cut out TV news from my life like 4 or 5 years ago. I don't consume it at all because it doesn't add anything beneficial. Apart from sports and weather, there's nothing of value on TV news, in my opinion.
So I would mostly agree with you. And my primary news sources are not TV. I mean, I don't watch that much TV anyway. I have occasionally seen some news programs that I felt were consciously trying not to be biased.
Yeah, but that's going to be the exception, though.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. So this is just another example of a good example of you consciously curating your input streams.
Right. Trying to get news from television is like trying to get nutrition from candy. You can't do it, and if you try, you're just going to make yourself sick.
Do you think it's possible to, like let's say I do that, right? And I'm all up in my pure news streams of what I consider to be my own information, and my mind is hygienic. Here's one way to phrase it. Knowing that it is not possible, or rather presuming that it's not possible to forcibly open the epistemically closed doors of somebody who is hard popping the blue pills.
Mm-hmm.
How do I empower others to enjoy the same freedom, right? Because you're talking about demagogues before, and nobody wants power hungry demagogues taking advantage of human weakness in order to affect, world events. And so how do I reach out to my fellow human beings who who I connect with as human beings, I suppose, and yet are holding on fast to the rings of their world, right? In defense of what their view is. How do we reach those fellow human beings?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm probably a bit more pessimistic about this. A lot of things in life are cyclical, so it may be just like a brush fire. You just got to let it burn itself out.
This iteration of civilization, we just gotta let it burn itself out, dude.
I don't know. I mean, all I can do is try to curate these things for myself and try to be self-aware about what I'm consuming. I don't know what you can do on a large scale.
Yeah,
I think you got to start with yourself. I think that's the message. You have to care enough about your own mind to want to feed it good stuff.
so I agree with you. And do you like the fluffy phrasing of "to change the world, change yourself"?
Yeah, I do like that.
I mean, that's a very core element of a lot of spiritual foofy kind of stuff.
Oh, well, I mean, you can be as fluffy as you like, but the golden rule is universal to every culture.
Right.
Do unto others that's as fundamental to human morality as you can get.
Okay. So here's the last concept then that I'll ask you about. So in this backdrop of how do we reach out to others when the walls of my epistemic world seem so completely counter to the walls of somebody else's epistemic world? Because on the one hand, if on the surface they seem so diametrically opposed, that is the manifestation of my perspective and the manifestation of their perspective, then on that front, then logically I shouldn't want to reach out to them, right? It should just be a Darwinian survival of the fittest and the strongest, fight to the death. Yeah, it's going to burn out, but you're going to be the ones that are going to burn out, and my side is going to win because we're right, etc. That's one way to look at it. But the other way is this presumption that underneath it all, we're all equally valued human beings. And so I should want to reach out to this person in their fishbowl as a person from my own fishbowl so that we can find some level of connection. And so to me, the reason why that question is fascinating to me is that that's definitely how I feel. That feeling is to me as clear and bright in my consciousness as anything else I realize. And yet it doesn't make any logical sense to me. Like this, what I'm trying to get at is, why do I care about other people? Right? Like, to me, the reason that's so fascinating is because it really, for the very reason that it has no logical answer, it, to me, strongly suggests another dimension of my nature, of my experience, of my consciousness, whatever you want to call it. Like there's no satisfying explanation for care and compassion for others and life and the universe and everything. Do you feel that way?
This might surprise you, but I think I'm a big believer in karma.
Okay. Karma in what sense?
Karma in that what goes around comes around, in that there's a reason to be nice to other people because they'll be nice to you. I think that's more of a mathematical function of the universe rather than any kind of fluffy design or.
So, all right. So that sense of karma to me is unsatisfying because
Okay.
and the reason being is that in the definition, maybe I'm misunderstanding your definition, but in that articulation, it's still just for my own self-servingness. Like the reason why I am nice to you is because I don't want to experience negative effect, right? Or it's going to be advantageous to me in some way.
But that's a good use of self-interest, though, because it increases the benefit for everyone.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it doesn't have pragmatic utility in terms of people getting along and not killing each other. But it's to me in the end an unsatisfying explanation of why I care about other people.
It may not be your reason, but I think if a lot of people had that reason, we'd be a lot better off.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no. I guess what's unsatisfying to me about it is that it just becomes this kind of business contract. Then it's kind of like, all right, Tom, we're going to have to hit this concept now. Love. I'm sorry. Hey, I waited till episode what 5, 6. So, like, if I feel like I love somebody, right, in terms of like I care for them in the purest, most unconditional manner, then I don't love them for any reason per se. I don't love them for what they can do for me.
You don't need anything in return.
Exactly.
And that's not the motivation for why you do so.
Right. If it was, then it would just be tit for tat. Like, you're doing this, I'm doing that. And
Yeah. But those relationships are special. You don't love everybody. At least I hope you don't.
Tom, I have a confession to make on the 2-Bit Geeks podcast. I love everybody.
Isn't that sweet?
I mean, I have to be honest about when I peel it back, right? When I get myself into a zone where I'm not in any particular nasty mood or whatever, and I just ask myself, how do I feel about every human being, life, the universe in general? That I feel love for existence.
Well, I can't say that I've achieved that level of enlightenment, but maybe you can work on me somewhat.
Right. So, I mean, the thing that's fascinating is that I don't understand that feeling. And yet, because it has no, I don't want to dismiss it because it has no logical underpinning. I want to be a good scientist. I don't want to dismiss the data point just because it makes the chart messy. and yet I don't want to dismiss the more clear, I want to say clear-headed, but the capacity for cognitive self-reflection either. I think I would like to think those two things can exist simultaneously. Right. That's why I love this topic, is that it's
You clearly love this topic.
well, because there's no motivation for reaching out to the other tribe if I don't inherently care about the other tribe. Now look, what you were saying is true. I don't have to jump all the way to the end of universal love in order to see this self-interest argument for it makes sense for our tribes to work together. And you were even suggesting a further base mechanism of the universe of karma.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have at this point, like a good sense of how that operates in terms of the mechanism? Or
no.
Just sort of a base feeling, kind of like raw exploration of there's some notion out there.
I'm just using that term in a colloquial sense. I mean, I don't have any deep understanding of karma in the traditional Eastern mysticism.
Right.
View, but
yeah, I mean, there's definitely different takes on it, different interpretations. Well, cool. Have we solved the problems of humanity?
I don't think so. I don't think we can solve them either. I mean, we're just two chumps doing a podcast. What are we going to do?
Right. We're just reflecting upon it. And we're sharing it with the universe. There you go. So, I can never tell when we get to the end of these things if we're trying to end on a positive or unconditioned note. What the more interest to entertaining? I don't know.
Yeah. It is what it is. Take it or leave it.
Absolutely. Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening. A quick note that you can always find show notes for each episode at 2bitgeeks.com. And we also like to share fun extras on our Facebook page at facebook.com/2bitgeeks. See ya!